Beautiful people, welcome in for episode 16 of the Homie Love Hour with me, your host, Joe Buck. Now, I am so very excited. I reached out to this person before I even started this podcast about coming on because I've always been blown away by their creative process and their ability to tell a story and to make everything so enveloping and so enthralling. So please help me in welcoming today's special guest, Mr. J.W.G. Wise, the creator of the Weeping Cedars universe.
Hey, Joe.
Hey,
How's it going?
No complaints. How about yourself?
Doing all right. Doing all right.
I'm glad to hear that. So, for the sake of not having to call you JWG Wise the
Mm-hmm.
entire episode, we're just going to call you Josh for short. Does that work?
Yep. Yeah, that works.
Fantastic. So, Josh, how's your week going?
It's going okay, all things considered. It's a busy time and sort of a complicated time of life, but it's going okay.
Hey, man, that's kind of what this podcast is for. You know, to help each other get through those tough times, the strange times, the times when you're feeling uncomfortable and you're like, I don't know what's going to happen next. This podcast is here to give that little bit of solace to help us get through until, we kind of start to see the light and see that little bit of clarity. So first of all, thank you so much for being here. I feel like a huge fanboy right now. I think I started following you, man, it could have been like a year, 2 years. I don't know. Time seems to, be an illusion.
Right. Time's a flat circle.
But every few months, I feel like I go back and I revisit Weeping Cedars and season 1 of Rod of Amber. Actually, I have the clip. I'll send it to you. Again, I never posted it like I messaged you yesterday. I never posted it because I was like, I don't want to just like make this dude uncomfortable. Who is this stranger and why is he talking about my stuff on his podcast? But like listening to your stuff, I'm like, man, I want to listen more. It went from like, oh, okay, this is nice, noise while I'm walking the dog, to, okay, let me turn the volume up, to, hey, everyone around me, stop making noise because I really need to listen into what's going on. So,
I appreciate that. It's very nice to hear. I don't often get to hear from people who listen. I've yet to ever meet anybody in real life who's ever listened to any of the stuff that I've done, but this is about as close as I've got.
Do you prefer it that way? Because I know some other horror story writers or people who live in the literary world prefer to be a little bit more elusive. Do you prefer it that way, or every so often when you hear people potentially talking about it in public, are you like, hey, that's my story?
So I think I would love to have it. I would love to. The old expression, or the way that I've heard this expression once, is the only way that I've ever heard it make sense. But I would love to eat my cake and have it too. Which is like I would love to hear people talk about the show. I would love to go somewhere and someone see the Weeping Cedars sticker on my laptop and say like, hey, I listened to that. Never ever happened to me. And that, that's sort of a lifelong dream. It would be nice to know that the thing is out there living its own life. And to some degree, I get that because we've had the Discord for a long time, but I've moved a lot of that discussion over to the Reddit. And the Reddit is now kind of, it's doing its thing. We have a couple hundred people there. And so it's interesting to see people doing that stuff. But I also like the distance, because I do have sort of a writing philosophy that while for all legal purposes Weeping Cedars is 100% mine, from a sort of metaphysical perspective, I don't feel like I made this thing. This feels, I subscribe very strongly to Stephen King's idea that we don't make up stories, we find them. And I really compare writing to archaeology. Like I do paleontology. Like I found a dinosaur, I am digging it out. I might chip it in places, I might break it in places. The dinosaur I found might not be complete, but I didn't make this thing. I'm excavating this thing. And so you get to have a little bit of distance there. So, it would be that push and pull of the distance and the closeness is maybe where I would like to live.
Yeah. So that actually brings me to my first question.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so with the creation of the Weeping Cedars universe and the podcast and the books that you are now putting together, how did Weeping Cedars come to be? Was there a moment, an event, a place that you visited, or was there like a dream? Kind of
Right.
how did that come to be?
Yeah, it's as I've sort of excavated Weeping Cedar's own like creation, I've had a lot of time to think about this. There isn't one moment. I would say if I was to look at maybe the earliest moment where Weeping Cedars has its roots, I would say that it's probably the late 80s, looking at a Nintendo Power with Maniac Mansion on the cover. Like, there was this moment that I discovered when I looked at that, and I have that Nintendo Power now sitting on a shelf, where seeing this map of this house and the horror elements and the comedy elements together, it spoke to me on like a root basic human level that said, hey, this is your thing. And uh C.S. Lewis has this book called Surprised by Joy, where he talks about like his sort of autobiography, and he talks about this moment where he hears a record with I think it's a song, but it might be a poem, where somebody says, Balder the Beautiful is dead, is dead. And this longing just grows up inside of him, and he calls that joy. And that's the feeling I had when I saw Maniac Mansion. It's not as, as venerable as Balder the Beautiful from Norse mythology, but that love of a place where it's intricate, it's lived in, it's deep, and you can visit it. That's probably the first moment where I can look back and say, there are the roots of Weeping Cedars. But I also grew up in a town that I based Weeping Cedars on. I grew up in a colonial town on the East Coast that has an old mill. It has streets named after the mill. It is, it's very much a town with the same kind of age that Weeping Cedars has. And so I grew up in a context of, hundreds of years of history that were just right there to touch. And then, you sort of jump forward and you go, okay, well, clearly the Blair Witch had something to do with making Weeping Cedars, and more. There was this little documentary that it's a fake documentary, which should already be an indication that this had an influence. But there's this little fake documentary that they put out with the Blair Witch Project called Curse of the Blair Witch. And if you watch that and you go, okay, the guy who made Weeping Cedars watched this and loved this, there's gonna be a lot where you're gonna like, oh yeah, no, he stole that and he stole that. there's the old man in the historical society. There's the witch in the town with the weird rituals and the sacrifices. And so there's that. True Detective is in there. But also from the perspective of just making it an audio drama, I had a buddy who pointed me in the direction of audio dramas around 2007. But that was also around the time when I played Fallout 3.
Okay.
And there's an audio drama in Fallout 3, which is this British guy with his ghoul manservant. And it's this old time radio drama type thing. And I was like, I want to do that. I want to make something like that. And I think that was actually a little later than 2007 because I was, it sort of directly influenced my first audio drama, which was called, which is nothing like Weeping Cedars, but it was called The Adventures of Lord Dinby Witherspoon, Duke of Space. And it was a 24 episode, 2-season series of satirical space British Empire comedy, sci-fi, about a nobleman who flies his ship around space and is really dedicated to the British space empire. And it was sort of a send-up of government and religion and imperial power, but not so much of a send-up that the people were villains. That I was also trying to do something where I thought the people here are noble if misled. And then eventually Weeping Cedars sort of became the next thing. And I was working on projects after that. I was trying to figure out what's the next story, what's the next thing I want to do. And this story about a town started developing and went through a lot of different incarnations before I settled on just ripping off maybe the most important inspiration for Weeping Cedars, which is Silent Hill.
Yeah, okay. That, like, it's like hearing your inspirations.
Uh-huh.
Once you hear the inspirations, you're kind of like, okay, yeah, I know
Right.
that.
Yeah.
It's because it is very, very interesting, and being able to take all these different elements and meld them together and make it work, I think is so important. It's like you sometimes you see that in other people's works
Mm-hmm.
where, they take different pieces from their inspirations, but there is no sort of fluidity to it. And
Mm.
and it's like it never properly settles. So it's like going into an old house where as you're going through, you're like, okay, there's a random step here.
Right. Yeah.
There's creaking. They're like, oh, the house is still settling. It's like it's a 150-year-old house. Why is it still settling? Like it should be done by now. But it's amazing. And you know so without giving away too much of
Mm-hmm.
the story, strictly for Weeping Cedars, we can talk more about the expansion of the universe and what that means in the other settings of Weeping Cedars. But in the town itself, the personification of the Candaset River,
Uh-huh.
what is that like, trying to bring a river to life?
It's funny. So, Weeping Cedars, a lot of people who listen to the show don't know this, or maybe I don't have a good way of knowing who knows it and who doesn't.
Mm.
But the podcast as it exists was not the first podcast appearance of Weeping Cedars. It first showed up sort of like The Simpsons in what's her name's show in the 80s. I can't remember her name now, but very famous comedian, British lady. But The Simpsons were on her show first,
Okay.
before they had their own. So Weeping Cedars showed up as a 7-episode actual play podcast on another show called Refugees of Esmeralda.
Right.
And for the most part, what I was thinking was, I want to make a town that I basically want to game master a game where I can bring people through Silent Hill, but I'm going to file all the names off and I'm going to write my own history. And so part of that process was just this sort of trying to figure out who the villain was of that story.
Mhm.
And at some point, and I don't know which came first, whether it was the name of the drowned boy, Daseth, or whether it was the Akondaset River, at some point, one of those names popped into my head and the other one followed from it, right? Like it was this sort of dual inspiration. And the moment that you get your hands on a word like Akondaset, you go, okay, well, that's just the sound of it is great. And so what does it say? How does it play out? So that can be enough in some ways. If you just get your hands on a good sounding word,
Mhm.
now all of a sudden you're like, okay, what is this thing? And I've been re-listening. Can I announce something on your podcast?
Yeah.
I'll reveal something that I haven't. I've been talking about this as a project
Okay.
without announcing it.
Yeah.
So I am going through that original series because it's actually kind of hard to listen to. We didn't record it very well. A lot of people don't want to go through an actual play podcast. They're not interested in that. So I've been transcribing that entire series. And I'm going to be releasing that as a book next year with kind of the canon elements fixed in it. I'm going to have the original pieces as footnotes, but I'm going to be kind of recanonizing that original adventure. But you can see in that original adventure, like things that I had already worked out. The idea that the river is hungry, although I didn't quite get to the very succinct phrase, he is hungry, until
Mm.
the final actual series itself. But I mean, it really is just this sort of long process of you just think and think and think, and you write, and eventually those pieces come together.
Kind of incorporating those human elements. And, for those who haven't, seen or listened to or read The Refugees of Esmeralda, when you use the phrase "he is hungry"
Mm-hmm.
to describe the river, does that phrase ever haunt you? Or do you just like that feeling of foreboding and discomfort attached to it? Does that ever come back up to you, or whenever you're doing your creative process, when it comes to referencing the river, are you kind of like, fuck, that's so, like, to me it's so tough because it's such a succinct sentence where it's like, shit, like the river's hungry, like fuck, like I don't, but there's so much attached to those three words.
Mm-hmm. It's so the question of, like, in sort of a broader way, does Weeping Cedars ever scare me, or does it ever give me the chills? And whether it's that or some of the larger lore. And the answer to that is mostly no, because I have a very strange, you know how some people have synesthesia, and where, like, they can, they senses trigger on different wavelengths. So you get, like, you taste color, or you hear color, or things along those lines. I'm not accurately representing it, but that idea that there's sort of crossed wiring, so you're getting multiple experiences at once.
Mm.
For me, certain kinds of horror are an aesthetic experience. So they are beauty. And a lot of the times when I watch horror or I read horror, or horror sort of pops up into my head, it's less about it scare me and more about, do I think it's beautiful? Does it trigger the aesthetic experience in my mind? And the idea of, something as succinct as "he is hungry," specifically associated with the river and the drowned boy, that triggers the aesthetic experience. I will say the one thing that really did chill me when I was writing the original series was the end of the Book of the Witch. That was a point where I went, ooh, okay, that sends tingles up my spine. But it's interesting. I think the aesthetics of it for me have always been the central piece. I think the first time I ever looked at something horrifying and thought, oh, that's beautiful, do you remember Suncoast Video?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was in a Suncoast Video in a mall, and I was, just perusing the horror section. And I found the movie Session 9. And it is this tiny little independent film that was shot at Danvers State Mental Hospital in Massachusetts, which has since been torn down. And it stars David Caruso, and the guy who now plays, or played, the old dwarven king in the Rings of Power. And it's this little horror film about hazmat guys going in to remove asbestos and stuff from a mental institution.
Yeah.
And the cover is just this hallway in this dilapidated mental institution with a wheelchair. It might even be a restraint chair in the middle. And my brain went, that's beautiful. I need to see this movie. And I saw it, and it's one of my favorite horror movies of all time. It's so slow and so quiet.
It's actually, I remember watching that movie. I
Uh-huh.
never knew what it was called,
Okay.
but I remember, like, even as a kid, with it playing in the background and like seeing this desolate facility
Mm-hmm.
and the eeriness that the scenes set.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's, to me, that's a sign of a good, I guess in that regard, that would be a good director.
Mm-hmm.
But stuff that you do really well, the creators of Old Gods of Appalachia, and other podcasts that I've referenced to you, is, instead of giving a 5-minute description of a set,
Mm-hmm.
saying, oh, well, there's this and there's that, your ability to, I guess, portray a setting with, the characters and the the communication, I
Hmm.
think is amazing because it does so much. You don't need the entire backstory because you're able to piece it together as you go. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's kind of the hope. Like my ethos for a lot of these, especially the podcasts, because I don't like contrived things. I think facade is one of my least favorite things in general. But in storytelling, I'm 100% the guy who's sitting there going like, that doesn't work like that. That doesn't
Mhm.
work like that. That's not how that, doesn't function that way. People don't do that thing. So much so that now, as I'm writing the next novel in the Weeping Cedars universe, it's set in northeastern Oregon in 1976. So I've been in touch with like the Oregon State Police archives, and I have like 1975 and 1976 state police reports, so I can get facts right. Like I'm reading through criminal investigation manuals from the early 70s, so I know what's right because I don't want people kind of looking at things and going like, that's not how that works.
Mhm.
And by doing that, I think, or at least the goal is that if I'm able to give people a real enough world, a world that's enough like reality, it does a couple of things. First, I don't have to describe that much. I can already put you in a place that feels real.
Mhm.
And second, it lends weight to the horror because it's you haven't had to kind of exercise those suspension of disbelief muscles too much
Mhm.
when you get there. So the other piece of that philosophy though is that very few of us are the star of the show. So I like to focus on the people who aren't the star of the show.
Mhm.
In fact, I think for Weeping Cedars there are like the original podcast. I think there's like four main characters, and we only ever hear directly from one of them in that series. The other three main characters you never see. They're one of them has been dead for 120 years or 130 years, and the other two are not normal people, so they're not going to come on the podcast.
Right.
So like I like that idea of like letting people know that there's another story going on, and therefore you don't have to get too deep on some of the detail. Now of course the entire show is details, so
Mhm.
there's that too.
Yeah. Also, like, I really appreciate how uncomfortable the setting is,
Mm.
but for a lot of the characters, they're like, yeah, this is everyday life.
Hmm.
This is like going for a walk to the grocery store. Oh, people are disappearing? Huh? Never thought anything of it. And it's like that acceptance of the surreal, I think,
Hmm.
for me makes it that much more believable, as much of an oxymoron as that may
Right.
come off. You know what I
Right.
mean?
I mean, to some degree, I used to advertise the show as Serial, the podcast Serial meets Dairy Maine.
Okay.
Like if you were to take, because Serial was actually like those NPR based podcasts were a big inspiration on rhythm and tone. Serial and Shittown were kind of the two that were. Have you ever listened to Shittown?
No.
It's a great one season documentary. It's heartbreaking, but it was kind of at the same time that first season of Serial came out, and it's a great piece of reporting. Of course, I've never followed up, so there might be someone out there might be listening to like, actually, there's all sorts of problems with that show. So I'm caveating that and saying I haven't followed up with it since.
Mhm.
Um, but it was very much the idea of like, okay, what if you lived in Derry, Maine, or you lived in Silent Hill, and what would it be like to do a documentary about it? Because obviously people live in places where bad things happen a lot.
Mhm.
And that's just sort of part of life. But also, if you look at towns, just general small life town, I mean, small town life,
Mhm.
uh, uh, when you condense all the tragedies in the history of a town, right, into a podcast, then all of a sudden you say, well, I mean, how could you miss it? right? Like, how could you miss all of these people going missing or all of these terrible things? But when you're living it and those things are spread out over 7 years or 10 years or 15 years, then all of a sudden you're like, oh no, that's just where we all live. We
Yeah.
all live in a place where somebody goes missing every year. We all live in a place where somebody runs away or dies hiking or whatever. Like, that's just reality. So yeah, when you condense it down, you do have to kind of say like, okay, how do these people not see it? But then if you kind of look at your own crime reports in your town, you're like, oh wait, no, maybe I live in a similar place.
Yeah. Have you ever been doing research for like the next you scene for a continuation of the podcast or a book or something along your lines, and you're kind of just like, holy shit, this setting may be a little too dark just because of real world events?
Yeah, so I have a philosophy to try to not profit off of other people's direct tragedy.
Mm.
I have this like I have this deep distaste for true crime podcasts, where I'm like, wow, those people are still out there, they're still suffering, and you're like, yeah, and then this happened, and then this. So I I think there are times when I do things that are really dark in the show, and one of the things that inspired me was, I think it was one of the creators, maybe of the Magnus Archives. I think I'm not 100% sure who said this, but they said this quote. I think it was on Reddit that was basically, in horror don't mix properly, because the point of a mystery is to open the box, see what's inside, and that's antithetical to horror, because once you open the box and see what's inside, it's not scary anymore. And a lot of the philosophy behind Weeping Cedars was like, no, you can do that. You can make it so that when you open the box, the thing inside is more terrifying than the question that you had. And so I tried to do that with Weeping Cedars, where you have things like, how does Brian Shawson, the baby, how does he die? That's more disturbing to me than a lot of the things that are sort of open and out there. And those are things you have to piece together. You're not going to get to how that child died without doing some puzzle work. And so I wanted the disturbing stuff, the really disturbing stuff, the stuff where you go like, geez, why is that there? That's horrifying. I wanted that to require a little work. But I've also never, other than my big topics, like I don't do sexual assault. That's not interesting to me as a horror topic. Lightning Falls, which is the first novel that's coming out later this year, deals with sexuality a lot, but there isn't sexual assault in it. So for me, that's kind of the one topic where I'm just like, nah, I'm not, that's too dark. I'm not going to do that. But I'll have monsters eat babies all day. That I don't, I don't care about that. But I've generally not avoided anything because it's too dark, or because I found something in real life that was too dark. We were at an antique store a couple of months ago, and they just had stacks of old newspapers. And the top thing on one of the newspapers from like the 30s or the 20s was just like chopped up little girl's body found, and this guy admits to it, and like her arm and her leg were missing from the pile of pieces of her body. And I was like, holy shit, like, okay. Like, we don't think about serial killers back then, but there they are, like, so that sort of stuff, I'll never use that in a story, but it's sitting there. It's like living there, and there's a part of my mind that goes, okay, well, at some point that's going to bubble up in some way, and that girl, I'll never use that girl, but she's going to inform something that happens. So I really, really try never to entertain people with real people's horror, but it certainly affects it, and nothing has ever really shown up where I was like, that's too dark. Barring my kind of no-go areas.
Right. So also with sticking to the town of Weeping Cedars, the killing of the slave catchers from the early episodes, and the town sort of harboring the slaves, and what leads to the fire and all that type of stuff. Was there any part of you that was apprehensive about including any of that in the overall story, or did you feel that it was so pivotal that it needed to be there?
Yeah, I didn't feel trepidatious about it until people started talking to me about it. Because to me, verisimilitude is deeply important. I didn't set out to make kind of the evil of Weeping Cedars specifically to be racially involved,
Mm.
but at a very early point you go, okay, well, I'm dealing with a town here that exists during the Civil War, that exists before the Civil War, that exists, and I grew up in a town that had a very sort of famous, locally famous abolitionist's house on my street, and he was part of the Underground Railroad. And so like from childhood, that was just part of how I understood the history of the East Coast was, like you especially as living north of the Mason-Dixon line, I was like, okay, so this is who we were, right? Like if you were a good guy, you helped. But it's hard to, and all, I mean, I also come from an area where Quakers are, a massive influence in the history of the area. And, being abolitionists, being pacifists, that stuff was deeply ingrained in just how I understood America to be as part of its complex, warp and woof of its realities. To me, that was just like, well, it has to be there. To ignore it would be to, I don't know, to do something really weird. I mean, you could obviously say, well, you're in northern New York, and that it's a very remote town, and you could just sort of say that well, it's a bunch of white people up here, so like let's not have to deal with that.
Mm.
But it just didn't feel right. And I never try to put things in books because I want to specifically address an issue, or stories. But at the same time, I've largely not removed things because I thought they would be controversial. Kind of moving away from race to gender, given that there's like the first narrator in Weeping Cedars is a gender nonconforming person who talks about their gender studies in the first episode.
Mm-hmm.
That has put a lot of people off, and that was never my intention. Was never to like kind of gatekeep the story to people who are okay with gender nonconforming people, but it has turned out that way, and I'm fine with like but it was never, that was also never my goal. That was, Laurel came in, got the part, and I said to Laurel the same thing that I say to every actor, or at least I try to remember to. I may have missed one or two people, but that is there anything you want to play that you've never gotten to play, or you don't get to play enough?
Mm.
Is there something about the character you would like to be true that you don't get to play very much? And they said, yeah, I would like them to be gender nonconforming. That would be, and I was like, great, that I don't have any reason for them not to be. So let's do that. And the thing I used to catch a lot of flack from was that there are people who misgender Lee in the series. And my defense to that was always, yeah, but they don't know. Like Emma misgenders Lee at one point. And I was like, but Emma doesn't know what Lee's gender identity is. So she's just going to think it's a couple of chicks at the Historical Society, because again, to me, the reality is much more important than any particular, I don't know, serving any particular ideology or whatever. But I also largely take the viewpoint overall, and this is something I'm not a big fan of in popular culture or expression, is I do think I've come around to the viewpoint that all art is political. But I also then think that you should then let artists be political as artists. Let art be political, and don't require artists to say, now here is my political position, as if I am a politician. Let the art speak. And I think that's, again, I'm not saying I set out with some sort of goal to do that, but like that is kind of my philosophy about it. And I think just kind of where the story led, the story was, you get this feeling in your chest, and I don't know if other writers get it or not, but you get this feeling in your chest as you start to write something that goes, ooh, this is it. You go, follow this, go down this path. This is where the words are leading. And that was very much where, the slave catchers and then all the xenophobia that follows after it, and and kind of the complex relations to race and gender and religion and all of those things that kind of come up in the series. They were never kind of, I didn't set out to write about them, but when that path opened up, that feeling in your chest just goes, come with me down this path. This is where you want to go.
Yeah, and like I genuinely appreciate, like I'm sure there were people who were uncomfortable with everything that happened,
Mm-hmm.
regarding the slave catchers and slaves and the fire and the Quakers, and even some of the characters being gender nonconforming. But it's really important that, for me, that there is visibility. Like
Mm.
there have been writers, producers, creators in the past who have just added characters for the sake of being like, well, this is what's popular right now, let
Uh-huh.
me add this in. But giving, these voice actors a chance to play something never played before,
Mm-hmm.
but without taking away from the characters, is one, I think, is amazing and pretty genius. And two, it's like, if this takes place in the place where this is all happening, if it's historically accurate, it's historically accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, to put everyone in these boxes to say, hey, everyone who lived in this town was white, there were never any issues.
Right.
I think it robs the reader of the authenticity, but it also stunts the growth of not only the town and the characters within it, but the universe as a whole. Because if everyone is only subscribing to these very menial beliefs, how is it that they can ever grow as characters? Let alone, how does the universe ever continue to evolve to become more than what it once was?
Right. Yeah, it's really I one of the there was one person who had like a lot of, most people when they don't like Weeping Cedars, they don't like it because they think it's boring. And I cannot argue with them about that. It's a slow show, and if it's not catching you, it's going to be boring. So like I get that. I have no issue with that. But somebody posted, I think it was to Tumblr, about how racist the show was, and how it erased Native Americans. And because I said, like, yeah, the local Native Americans, they don't come here. Like, they were, my view was like, I'm like, no, these original people were smart enough not to show up
Yeah.
here. Like, it's the white people who were stupid enough to come here and stay. But I did, uh, but so I took that as kind of a challenge too, because I was like, all right, well, when I write my next thing, which is Lightning Falls, which takes place in Wallowa County, Oregon, I
Right.
was like, I'm reading as many books as I can about the native peoples who lived here. And I want to know, even if for the most part it's not going to show up in the book, I want to know what about the Nez Perce and the Cayuse and the Umatilla. I want to know about the history of the place, and when did these conflicts happen and that sort of stuff. Okay, the book's not about that. There's a section that deals with it. Like, I don't ever want to just have blind spots. I guess that's kind of my
Right.
big thing. Like, I never want to be the person who's like, well, all right, time to throw in a token character because that's hot with people. One of the main supporting cast in Lightning Falls is Black, and she's the main character's good friend. And I wanted to really emphasize with her to say, like, she has her own life and interests that's not about the main character. And like, it's really easy to get tunnel vision. It's really easy to get myopathy with just like your own personal experience. And that's actually one of the things I really value about asking actors about what they want to play, is because they're going to bring something to it that I don't know. Right? Like, they're going to bring something to it that I didn't think of. And so my answer to them always when they're reading scripts is always like, I'm not precious about the words. You read it the way that you think a person would read it.
Mm.
And if that changes some of the words, that happened a couple times with Weeping Cedars, is Laurel came to me and was like, I don't think Lee would say men and women. I think Lee would say people. And I was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like, that's not how she's going to categorize, or they're going to categorize people.
Mm.
But yeah, I think you have to be constantly trying to see the world in a bigger way than you did when you started the project. Otherwise, yeah. Otherwise, in some ways, you're not in a conversation with the world, right?
Mhm.
Like you're dictating to the world what you think the world is, as opposed to allowing the world to kind of talk to you and then you talk back to it.
So, along the lines of characters that you have created,
Hmm.
so there is a certain character that I thoroughly enjoy
Okay.
who is a part of the radio show.
Okay.
How did they come to be, and what was the process like with creating them? Because it seems like no matter what's going on in the town, they're just like, hey, I'm having a good time. I got ice cream. Here's some drama. I got Chinese food. I'm just here to have a good time.
Okay. So I assume you're talking about Clarence.
Yes.
Okay. So Clarence is one of those characters where I was like, oh, Clarence is real swishy. I don't know if people are going to be cool with Clarence being as swishy as he is. But I was hanging out with a lot of gay dudes at the time. And I was like, I am just reporting where we're at with things.
Yeah.
I love Clarence. People love Clarence. My great shame, no, shame is the wrong word, but my great sorrow about that series is that Dan Chen, who played Clarence, just couldn't do it once pandemic started and sort
Mm.
of scheduling. I really hope to revisit Clarence in the novels. But Clarence was me. Here's the secret, I guess, to all of this, and I think a lot of writers will say this, so it's not really a secret. Is everybody's me? So Clarence is me to some degree.
Okay.
Um, and I'm just tapping into some part of myself that's like, okay, cool. There's some part of me that's a gay gossip queen in a small town, and then you just take that on and you're them. And that's, I think, part of the trick of some of the writing is that when you force a character or when you are like, all right, well, what would they do next? It's going to be really hard to write that character.
Hmm.
But when you feel like you're that character, when you're writing them, then it's just talking. Then it's just saying what you're saying. So, writing Clarence, I'm not exactly sure. I think functionally, I needed somebody who was going to be able to say what was happening in the town that wasn't just news, right? I
Okay.
needed a voice that served a purpose where you could get at the town from a different angle. And so he was going to tell you the social things that Emma wasn't going to tell you through news. Emma's not going to tell you who's dating who, but who's dating who is actually really important. And there's a whole plot line throughout the series about jilted love and who's related to who. And so there's a whole story thread through season 1 and 2 that if you unravel it, you go, oh, that's why this happened and this happened and this happened, all because this person cheated on this person. And so from a functional perspective, Clarence came from that place. But from just a like, okay, who would be who would be the gossip person in this town? Clarence just sort of popped into my head as like, yeah, he's this very swishy gay dude who he loves Jesus. This is the thing I always wanted to do with Clarence is that gentleman loves him some Jesus, he loves God, but he's like, I don't really care what the church says about me. I love God, and also I want to know what's going on in this town. But also, Clarence is part of, to some degree, and I never really got to delve into this, but Clarence is doing good work there. There's more going on with Clarence than just being the gossip queen on the radio. So again, that's something I really want to be able to explore in the novels that I didn't get to do, because in the podcast was going to explore that, but then life happened. So that's, but as to where Clarence just popped out of, I don't know. There's some part, I guess, where before I started writing the show, I don't know, for the last decade, just been hanging out with a fair number of gay dudes, and and some of them are not at all Clarence, and some of them are, and the ones that are just sort of coalesced for me.
Yeah. That's interesting. So when it comes to like the voice actors, do
Mhm.
you just post on a board and whoever responds, or are these friends of yours? Or are you actively seeking out, certain voice actors because you think they would be the best to bring your characters to life?
Yeah, it's interesting. I started, so when I first did The Adventures of Lord Dinby, I discovered this, it's not a secret webpage, but it's called Backstage.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's, yeah. So I found all of my actors for Lord Dinby off of Backstage. And I just, out of it, this is one of those things where I'm an old man from the 40s where I'm like, you do it by pulling up your bootstraps. Where I was like, well, no one ever told me how to write or cast an audio drama. I just went about doing it. And so I was like, great. Where do I find actors? And I looked that up, and then I just started writing scripts. And then I just started doing auditions. I'd never directed anything before. No one ever told me how to do it. I was just like, all right, great. I'm going to audition people. I'm going to write a short sample script. And then I'm just going to, when people apply for these parts, I'm going to send it to them and they're going to send me their auditions. I will let them know there's no money involved. And then that's going to, winnow out a bunch of people. It's not a union show. It's like not SAG-AFTRA. So that's going to, sift out a lot of people. And for that original series, I got some really amazing people for that show. And I made a really good friend out of that series, who played the Queen, and she became a good friend, even though I've never met her in real life. And then when it came to Weeping Cedars, I actually really wanted local talent because I wanted to be able. The original idea for Weeping Cedars was that it was going to be somewhat. And this is an insane idea. I understand this, and it has no congruity whatsoever with the final show. But the idea was to have it be somewhat off the cuff, like somewhat improv. I would give them facts,
Mm.
and then they would kind of riff on those facts, especially Emma. And that was not a good idea at all. That was a bad idea. But for Weeping Cedars, I actually cast people from Backstage in my local area.
Right.
And so we got together and we played a game called The Quiet Year, which I used to develop the history of Stone Mill. And so there's at some point, I'm going to release that stuff, but there's a map and there's notes where we made up the whole history of this town that existed before Weeping Cedars through this game. But so the idea was get people that are local because they can come and record with me. And for the most part, that was true. Laurel and Elise, who played Emma, were both local to me. I went through like 3 different people for Riley. I had a really good person for Riley at the beginning, and then I messed that up because I thought scheduling wasn't going to work. That was a mistake on my part because scheduling would have worked. And then I had another person come in and read for them. I had my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, read for her. And then finally we got the person who we got, who did a great job, but they weren't local. So it kind of didn't work out. But for the most part, I've just gone to Backstage and I've run auditions.
Nice.
And I go through and I write audition scripts, and I audition people, and for the most part, they've worked out.
Okay. So, with talking about writing, staying on that same vein, do you have like a certain ritual going into writing a script or the creation of a character? Or, is it just you start kind of going down a certain vein, and if you lose inspiration, you just kind of put a plug in it
Mm.
until you feel re-inspired?
So it is sort of like exploring a forest without any well-worn paths. You just sort of break into it and you go. And if you get to a good place, then great. If not, you backtrack and you try a different path. So for example, I try to do, so last year I did an experimental novel on my Substack that is a non-Weeping Cedars thing, but it's just a surrealistic horror novel. And the idea was I would just release a chapter a month. And part of the idea there was, hey, if you want to see how a horror novel gets written, here it is. You can watch the ideas change as the story goes on. So I will just start writing. Nowadays, because when it's Weeping Cedars, everything is so complicated that I need to make sure that what I'm doing fits in the universe. I will now often just block out sections on a timeline, make sure that the things that I think are happening are actually happening at that time. I would say 4 years ago, I printed out the family trees that I had for the Weeping Cedars universe, and they were about 50 pages of family trees. And that was 4 years ago. So now it's a lot more. But yeah, I'll just have programs open. Sometimes a writing session will be me sitting and writing 2,000 words. Sometimes it will be me writing, 100 words and then going, wait, who are they related to? And I will spend the next hour either working through existing family trees or building family trees, just laying down facts that may or may not themselves be particularly inspired, but they're hard points of truth inside of the world that allow me to know that what I'm doing isn't in conflict with something else.
Okay.
Other times will result in me writing 200 words and then just going down a rabbit hole of research, trying to find out whether or not this thing that I think might happen next would happen next. And then there are other times when it's just, okay, cool. It's, 2,000 words get knocked out in 40 minutes and then you come back to it later to see what goes, what stays. Lightning Falls, the novel took about it took about 6 months to write, and it's about 180,000 words, but it went through a couple of incarnations before this version of the book. There are, I think, 30,000, 40,000 word attempts before this version that do things quite differently. I mean, there's one that's just set in the 60s, and the main character, was at Kent State. And that's not this novel. But yeah, my process is just start writing, and see where the muse takes you. Because I believe in the muse. I believe that it's a real thing, but I also acknowledge that maybe that's just a good mental framework for describing it. But I do believe it's a real experience to just start writing, and then you're in a conversation, you're in a relationship with whatever it is that's pulling you along.
Okay. So, kind of expanding on that, and now, instead of just sticking strictly to the Weeping Cedars town and the initial setting, branching out into, Samite, Lightning Falls, Rod of Amber, all these other things with creating a universe. Because this would be a 3-part question, just to kind of consolidate things. 1, do you subscribe to linear or do you prefer non-linear storytelling? 2, how do you rein yourself in so you don't end up just going on these wild tangents that don't really serve a purpose? And 3, what do you think has been the hardest part about creating a universe as a whole? As expansive as it could be, or keeping it as, compacted as it may currently be. What's that whole process like?
Sure. Okay, so linear and nonlinear storytelling. Do you mean by that, do I tell the story in the order that it takes place, or do you mean the story itself is told in a linear fashion?
I guess that's kind of open for interpretation, because
Okay.
there's another podcast I listen to where they will start the main storyline takes place in, let's say, 1917. Then they will go to the next chapter, and that takes place in 1975. And the next chapter will kind of fill in that gap in between.
Okay. So yeah, I think when it comes to podcasts, I have 2 different philosophies about this. One, when you're writing a podcast, you're sort of bound by the format of whoever the podcast teller is, or if you're doing just a full cast narrative.
Okay.
Then you can of course jump around. And in fact, the very, very, very first story that I ever wrote, called Lightning Falls, was a time travel story. And it has almost nothing to do with the thing that's coming out later this year. And so that wouldn't have been told in linear order. I don't think necessarily that I'm married to telling a story in linear order unless, well, I guess you kind of default to that, but I also think there's lots of good reasons to move away from it. So I will say Lightning Falls is probably my best example of this, because well, I guess Weeping Cedars itself does not tell a story linearly, right? Like, it doesn't start at a time and then move forward. It jumps all over the place. But the novel Lightning Falls has 9 sections, and 5 of those sections are about the main character, and 4 of those sections are historical. So you're going to get, like 15 chapters about the main character, and then you'll get 10 chapters about somebody else from 1940. And so it will move back and forth. And then, like, Shards of Amber, which is the short story collection that goes along with Rod of Amber, jumps all over the place, but they're individual short stories. So yeah, I'm not necessarily a fan of just like linear storytelling unless that's the story you're telling, right? Like, that's the sort of experimental novel I'm working on right now for my Substack is much more of a traditional, like, hey, this is an homage to The Ring. It's an homage to It Follows, Smile. It's a horror movie as a novel, and you're going to get the vast majority of it is just going to be like point A to point B. But from a writing perspective, I do tend to write linearly, meaning I start with chapter 1 and I end with the last chapter. Okay. It's very rare that I'll go like, here's a chapter I want to write. I'll have ideas for scenes and I'll stub them out. Like, I'll put, a short description or maybe some dialogue, and I'll put them in their place. But I almost never write ahead.
Okay.
So that's that first question. Before I move on to the second one, do you have any questions about that?
I guess this would sort of tie into the second question is like, do you ever start to write about like a particular section of, let's say, Shards of Amber, where you're like, okay, I need to stop myself because if not, this is going to mess up something else that I'm working on in another part of the universe?
I mean, I certainly have to correct things. Like, I'll start writing something and then look things up in my references and think, oh, nope, I can't do that. That conflicts. But I never feel like I need to rein myself in. The only thing that's the only constraint, right, is the established facts. There's this wonderful quote from Raymond E. Feist. He wrote this series in the 80s. His fantasy series. And he said something along the lines of like, books are so much better than movies because if I make a movie, I'm bound by this budget. But I can just blow up a whole city for free if I want to. And so, I never feel like I have to rein myself in. The only real... So creatively, I feel like I have to rein myself in because I'm the person who wants to work on 5 projects at once. And I have had to, in a lot of ways, rein myself in to say, okay, but all 5 of those projects are Weeping Cedars. Or at least 4 of those projects are Weeping Cedars, because that's where I'm going to have some amount of success. That's where I can at least keep focus. So I do rein myself in creatively that way. But as far as like what stories I want to tell in the Weeping Cedars universe, no, it's much more about what makes sense to tell the next. I literally have a list of novels written down on a whiteboard that go out to 2036. Like, I know what the book is that comes out in 2036. I don't know what all the books are between, but I know what the one is that's coming out in 2036. So there isn't a lot of self-restraint here.
Do you want to drop the name of the last book? Or
yeah, absolutely. And it's not a secret. It's called They Call It Glory.
Okay.
And so it's anyone who listens to Samite and pays attention will know 2036 is the year when everything is supposed to come to a head. So the idea is that the book will come out the same year, unless I get mauled by a tiger or, hit by a meteor or something between now and then. That's the goal, is to release that book in 2036 so you can read it when it's happening. And that's also been sort of the philosophy of Weeping Cedars, is things come out when they happen. So Lightning Falls is set in September, October of 2025. Obviously there are lots of things that can't when I'm doing historical things or whatever, but that's a little bit of the philosophy of that, is put things out when they happen.
Okay.
And I guess your last question was, what's the hardest part of creating a universe?
Yeah, absolutely.
This is the part. See, here's what's going to happen, and I know this is what's going to happen. I'm going to answer this question, and then tomorrow it's going to be really hard for me to write because I'm about to give the answer that it's not hard.
Oh, no.
And largely it isn't hard. I've never found writing hard.
Mm,
Um, I I feel for the people who post constantly on social media and talk about how hard writing is. It's such a hard thing. It's so difficult, and I've never found it hard. It is a joy. It's like visiting a friend. It's for me. It's like saying, okay, well, when I get together with my guy friends and we all laugh and joke and say shit we wouldn't say around mixed company,
mm,
that's hard. It takes energy, right? And there's a certain point where you go like, cool, I'm good for a while, and I need to go do something else. But it's not hard. So I think I will say this. The hardest part is a meta thing, and that is that no one knows Weeping Cedars. Like, it is such a small community. It is such a small group of people, and the hardest part, and this is just being a human being. The hardest part is watching other things blow up, other people succeed, other things happen when your thing that you've put so much work into just kind of sits there and isn't isn't nearly as well known, isn't nearly as well loved as some other things, especially things that came out at the same time or didn't release nearly as many episodes. So there's like a very human flawed piece of that the hard part is I wish it were more successful.
yeah.
Part of that's ego and part of that's, hey, as a dude, I want to feel like the work that I'm doing is contributing to my own household. Like, I want to sort of have that dignity of my own work. And so I'd say probably that's the hardest part, is the meta piece of it, of like, it can be really tough to kind of watch other people blow up. Or I've never been a naturally like, oh man, I'm so happy for you that worked out for you, as I'm sitting there like going like, nobody gives a shit about my thing. Like, I'm really glad there are people who are like that, who are like, who naturally feel happy for other people's success. But as I'm like toiling away, I'm like, that's cool. Like,
Yeah. It's, I 100% get that. It's like, so when I was younger, I always wanted to be a writer, and I wrote a lot. I got like some short stories and poems published when I was younger.
nice.
I appreciate it. It was the time, but it's like I decided to get away from writing,
Hmm.
and my official reason was, at the time, every writer that I loved died in obscurity and poverty.
Mm.
But truthfully, I was, and even now, like, I'm still so scared to fail at something that I've loved my entire life. You know what I mean?
Mm.
And I mean, I'm sure that's something you could relate to, or maybe you're just like, hey, no, I know my day is coming. It's just a matter of getting there. But reading Langston Hughes, reading Maya Angelou,
Hmm.
reading, the Bronte sisters, all of
Hmm.
these, literary powerhouses, I'm like, I don't feel as though I could ever compare to them on their worst day.
Right.
Like, maybe if I did a bunch of opium, I could keep up with Edgar Allan Poe. But outside
Right.
of that, like, I couldn't write the next Telltale Heart or
Right.
the Cask of Amontillado. So the idea of never being able, feeling as though I could never live up to these people, is ultimately what was the driving force behind me to stop writing. And it wasn't until, crazy enough, I got into a car accident. This dude ran a red light, and I T-boned him.
Mm.
And I remember being so angry. And then he got out of his car and knocked on my window and asked me if I was okay.
Hmm.
And I'm like, yeah, I'm fine. Like, I just destroyed your car. And he was like, hey, it's fine. Let's just move him out of the road. So we move him and we start talking. And he's like, oh, like, where are you coming from? I was like, I was coming from campus. I just finished class. I'm on my way home. And I was like, where were you going? He's like, I was just going to do something. Like, very, very aloof about what he was doing.
Hmm.
So I don't remember how we started talking about the literary world, But he ended up telling me that he was a published author and that he went to like Cambridge and Oxford and went to all these very esteemed schools around the world. And he had like two or three PhDs and a master's degree. And he told me his name. And to this day, I cannot remember his last name.
Mm.
But, he was like, well, what kind of books do you like? So I started naming off some of my favorite books and some of my favorite writers. And I remember he looked at me and was like, I would have never guessed that you like those books, not because of how you look, but
Mm.
because of your age. He was like, those
Mm.
were the books my parents had me read when I was a child, and I
Right.
hated them. So I couldn't imagine someone in your age actually appreciating them, without being forced to have to read them. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Mhm.
And, as far as everything that you've put together, I think for some people, when they find what it is that you're creating and that you have created, it's impossible not to want more. You know what I mean? And
Well, I appreciate that. I've in a lot of ways my heroes are C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Like it's that's the world that Tolkien made is endlessly an inspiration to I'm one of those dorks who I haven't read it, but I've listened to the audiobook of the Silmarillion, like 5 times or whatever. Like it's the idea that this guy says, okay, I'm going to tell you a story, and that story is going to be big. And I mean, really at the heart of the story that I'm telling, one of the questions you sent me is like, do I have a favorite character? And I do, and it's Anna Holler. I love Anna. Like she is, um, she's an embodiment of the divine, and she's brave, and she takes for her example the great sign of self-sacrifice. And so, like, at the heart, I think when people tell stories, they tell stories in one of two ways. Either, well, I guess there's a few ways. One is just profit, like, hey, I want to be a writer, I want to sell books, I want to do whatever. I don't think much of that. And then there are people who are like, oh, this story is in my head, I need to put it out there. But then there's the, hey, I have a vision and I want to put it out into the world. And at the core of it, a lot of the times there's maybe a question, there's maybe an observation, there's maybe a feeling at the center of it. And at the center of Weeping Cedars is Anna Holler, is this girl who is capable of many, many things. She's brilliant. She has her whole future ahead of her. She can break through, glass ceilings, as they wouldn't have been called at the time, but like she's a genius, and she doesn't think that that's more important than standing up to evil. She takes as her inspiration this great question that is, to me, the ultimate question is sort of embodied in that old spiritual, will the circle be unbroken? And that is, to me, the fundamental question of all reality. Will the circle be unbroken? Will all of the breaking, will all of the degradation, will all of the death, will all of the darkness, will that be the last word? Or is there another voice? Is there another mind that will say, no, I will not let that stand?
mm,
And so, like, to me, I'm not trying to answer that question with this sort of small town cosmic horror mishmash of things. But it is, at the very heart of it, is the question, will there be a new world when this one is done? Is there light at the end, or will the last word be darkness? And I think all of the big characters in these stories are asking that question or fighting what they think the answer to that question is. That's what the Queen in Samite is doing. It's what the Librarian is doing. It's what the Unfettered Prince is doing. And of all of them, a teenage girl from upstate New York says, well, the answer is obvious. You do what's right. And you hope.
It's unbelievably profound and beautiful all at the same time. And it's like when you think about a character, you can take all of these neuroses and ideas of what you would do if you were in that place and try to project them onto them, or try to make them the most virtuous, or
Mhm.
the most brave, the smartest, the tallest, the strongest, whatever it is. But the idea of simply saying, I'm going to do what's right, is, I think, way more important to apply to your main character than all these other virtues that we'd want to see in a hero.
Right. The
Because,
things that we consider heroic.
yeah, exactly. Because, there's so much more depth to that. And it's an understanding that things might go south, things
Mhm.
might go horribly, but it will not change me, and it will not shake my resolve.
Yeah, and that's I want to be Anna Holler. Like I want to be so brave and so good.
Mm,
And that, but like everybody else, this is a thing that I find really interesting on the Reddit and the conversations that are had there and the conversations that used to be had on the Discord
mm,
about Weeping Cedars is everybody wants to know who the good guys are. Everybody wants to know, like, well, is the circle all bad? What about the Green Hill Society? Are they the good guys? And the answer is like no one's the good guys. Everybody's doing what they think is best. Some people are more motivated by power, some people are a little bit less selfish, but everybody sacrifices something they shouldn't, except for Anna.
mm.
Everybody walks a path that they will have to answer for if there is someone to answer to, except Anna. And that, like, that's way more interesting to me because I think we live in a world right now where a lot of people want very clear cut good guys and bad guys, heroes and villains. And I love that Willem Dafoe quote, which is something along the lines of, nobody thinks they're the bad guy. Everybody's righteous in their own eyes. And that is very much everybody from the greatest dark power in the Dark City to, the local sheriff who's trying to figure out how the hell to keep people inside in a curfew when there's terrible things happening outside to keep them safe. Like that's everybody is trying to do what they think is best. And they just have different judgments about what's worth sacrificing.
Yeah, that's, again, every single time I'm like, okay, I have a good understanding of this. You drop something like this on me, and I'm like, fuck, like it's so unbelievably true because, right or wrong, we're taught very early on that everything is black and white. Either you're
Mm-hmm.
wrong or you're right, you're the good guy or the bad guy, and that is it. But as you get older, you realize, like, that gray area is where we exist 90% of the time, sometimes even
Right.
more than that.
Right.
And it's all about perspective and how you see the situation that you're in leading up to that. And sometimes it's how can you convince yourself that you are the right person, even though you know that you're, actually not.
Right.
So the idea of adding that human element and that complexity to, the Green Hill Society, to all these other characters and organizations that you've created across this universe, again, is just another layer in, this universe where it's just like, man, like, I now want to delve further into it. I now want to know more. It's it's the motivations, it's the understanding, it's the perspective. These are all things that you don't normally think about, at least, when we were younger, when pertaining to the quote unquote bad guy or the good guy. And I
Right.
think that's something now that a lot of shows or books, or, much like you're doing, where that narrative is being challenged. Where, even in, oh God, there was a comic book I was reading recently where the hero is like, oh yeah, everyone loves me, but then they show a certain section from another part of the comic, and everyone is like, "Yo, we hate this guy. He ruins everything." But
Hmm.
he's so deluded that in his mind he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm great. Everyone loves me. Everyone's going to continue to love me. I can just do what I want."
Right. Yeah, I think, I mean, this is, and this is obviously coming from a very particular worldview or philosophy, but like the moment, so there's a Jewish philosopher from the 20th century named Martin Buber,
Yeah.
who I think encapsulates all of morality, because in a lot of ways he's inspired by Immanuel Kant. And that morality, he wrote a book called I and Thou. Um, um, and his philosophy was that you can have two perspectives towards the world. You can have an I it perspective, or you can have an I thou perspective. And either the world, whether that's the natural world, people, or supernatural beings, can be an it to you, meaning that they're just an object, they're there to be used or moved out of the way so you can achieve your goals, or they are a thou, they're a person, they're a you that can never be used in that way. And to me, all of evil is summed up by the I it perspective. And it's really Buber's philosophy, I would argue, that's kind of underpinning what I think is the way I understand the villains and the good guys who do the wrong things in my writing, is that the moment that you say, I'm willing to lay you down for my ends, is the moment you step out of the light. That's not to say sometimes you have to make hard decisions where you say like, well, I got to save these 5 people or these 10 people. Like, like I have to, shut off this part of the submarine so that everybody else doesn't drown. I don't mean those sort of philosophical, but I mean the moment that I say like, I want X and I'm willing to put you either hurt you or just end you so I can get what I want, is the moment you step out of the light.
Mm.
And the moments in my life where I've done that, I feel the most ashamed.
Mm.
And the characters that I write, they're evil insofar as they do that, and they're good insofar as they don't do that.
Mm.
And the same person can do both. And that's kind of where I try to understand people. And that's where I think a lot of the people who have listened to the show or tried to debate who's good, who's bad, who's to the right, who's in the wrong, that philosophical perspective is kind of missing from that evaluation of the work.
So I'll wrap it up and 2 more questions, and then I'll let you get back to your day. So we talked briefly before we started recording. You have a PhD in systematic theology with, I believe your dissertation was on ectology. Is that, did I say that?
Eschatology.
Eschatology. Yeah. Sorry. How has that sort of assisted, or I guess laid level of groundwork for your writing, and how has it kind of influenced your perspective on things?
Yeah, I would say so. There's a couple pieces to it. One, I've done sort of the the tour of Christianity. Like I was raised lapsed Catholic, so like I wasn't like devout and then lapsed. We just were immediately lapsed. So like we did CCD and stuff like that, but like nobody was really deep into it. Then I dated a girl whose dad was an evangelical fundamentalist, and I was like, cool, that's what I am now. And then I went and I got a degree in Bible and went, I can't be that guy because I'm not sure Moses ever existed. So I've sort of run around the different things. And the thing that I came to while I was doing my master's degree and my PhD was that there is a branch of Christian theology called apophatic theology, and it's an Eastern Orthodox view, and it is that the highest theology is silence. The highest theology is knowing that all of our words fail when they approach the divine, that words are a created thing and they can never contain what is transcendent. And so we have to give up on some level saying things about the divine because all of them will fail. And I really watched a lot of people just get really caught up in word games and distinctions that aren't real. And I became very, very disillusioned with that stuff. Well, at the same time, finding a lot of it fascinating. But I also saw deep in all of those things just a massive disconnect between who I understood the religion to even be about. Who was this Jewish man murdered by the state who was deeply in line with 8th century BC prophets who preached about the poor and the oppressed and those who the state and the powerful didn't care about. And so, man, what does all this have to do with him? And that has left a big impression on my writing in that almost everything I write is about religion. It's not necessarily called religion, but certainly the circle is a religion. The people who follow the Queen and Samite, they're a religion. Even the Green Hill Society, you have this thing where you have Anna Holler and then they build a society around her. And are they a good reflection of who she was? In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. And so it's about this, because what systematic theology is it's systematizing the intellectual aspects of a religion, and trying to put them in a coherent, logical order, so that one thing you're saying over here doesn't contradict another thing you're saying over here, or doesn't just contradict reason in general. And I know there are going to be people who say, like, well, all of religion contradicts reason, and that is a worldview that you can have. But I tend to think that some of what really influenced me was that religion is in everybody's life in some kind of way. They have a religion. And that just means they've oriented themselves towards what they think the meaning of the universe is. And they're gonna find community around that, and they're gonna find a purpose. And so much of what I write is about how that just goes wrong, and how you can mean so much good and do so much harm, and you don't have to be a villain to do that. And that you can really you can work yourself into a logical place where you can think, I'm doing the thing that's at the very core of my essence, which is I believe X, and you can do Y, and you can figure out a way to make those two things work together. Yeah, so I think it's one, coming to a place where academically I thought, well, I don't know that there's anything worth saying that isn't just trying to find a job. And that feels weird if I'm writing about God and all I'm doing is trying to find a job with it. But then part of it is that I think my political statement with my writing is very much about how, especially when you look at how people think about the end of the world, how that justifies how they live in it now, and what that means for what they're willing to do and what they're not willing to do. So I would say that's a huge influence on what I do.
Yeah, that's amazing. Like, kind of like what we talked about before we started. Like, I grew up going to church and then stepped away from it and came back, and people were always convinced that I was going to become a preacher or something along those lines. And the Bible always interested me, not because I felt any sort of religious fervor or any sort of attachment to it, but the fantastical nature in which the characters in the Bible lived, I think, was something that kind of resonated with me, because it's like, oh yeah, so this dude walked on water. Okay, so he fed the masses. Okay, this person who did this one thing to kind of shit on some peasant, and they, the reprieve from that, or the the decisions that came from that were absolutely devastating. I always it's I've always looked at a lot of religious texts as more of an allegorical tale on how to be a better person.
Sure.
And it's the idea that you have taken that and applied it to your writing to almost do the same thing but in a much more masterful way. Is I think it's fantastic. Every time, again, we start to talk, or like ask you a question, I'm just like, fuck, like I have to sit down and reevaluate my life, because I always think I have like some sort of understanding, and I'm like, well, I got to do better now. I don't know, I got to go find some evil society and shut them down, or I don't know, go do something cool out here.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me at least, the great I don't know. There's this really interesting moment at the end of the Gospel of John, which is a moment I don't think historically happened. I think that very much a text critical
Mm.
person, where I'm like, okay, what's the purpose of this text? What does it do? And I think what the end of the Gospel of John is doing is transferring authority from the apostle that Jesus loved, or the disciple that Jesus loved, which we identify as John,
Mm.
to Peter, because it seems like there was some story going around the Johannine community, and maybe a New Testament scholar will come along and say, well, that's an older theory, it doesn't really hold up anymore. But my understanding is that there's evidence in the text that there was this story going around that the disciple John would not die before Jesus returned.
Mm.
And so you get this moment where Peter says, or Jesus says to Peter, follow me. And Peter says, what about him? And pointing to John, and Jesus says, what is it to you if he should remain until I return? Follow me. And that interaction to me is this sort of admonition on the second hand admonition, because again, I think it's doing something historical for a very particular community at a very particular time. But I also think that you can abstract it and say, anytime when the question is, should I do the right thing or not? And if our response is, yeah, but what about that? And what about those people over there? And what about what they're doing? Goodness always says, what is that to you? Follow me. And that is, I think that's the core of why my hero is my hero in the story, is that it's just a girl that says, there's only one human being I have the authority to lay down, and that's myself.
Mm.
And I really, really, really hope I'm not trying to beat people over the head with that, because it's not meant to be a morality tale, but that is, I hope, at the core of it.
No, I mean, I feel like if anyone were to listen to this or read your books, listen to your podcasts, and be like, "Oh, this is a ham-fisted way of saying be a decent person," like, that would be probably the man. I feel like that would be such a disservice to themselves to only take that away from it, because there's so much more there. You know what I mean? It kind of
I
comes,
hope so.
yeah, it kind of comes full circle, again, going back to the simple phrase attached to the river of he is hungry, to minimalize this down to a single sentence, but not understand the implications attached to that sentence and the depth attached to it, is one of the worst things you could do to yourself, is to not take the time to understand the complexity attached to the simplicity of a sentence, which is a bit of an oxymoron, but it'll make sense to the right person.
Well, that's sort of the heart of mysticism, right? Is you take very simple things and they are a doorway into something more complicated, which I'm not claiming my series as some mystical doorway, but that is sort of the heart of mysticism, is to say you can take something very simple and open a much bigger world with it.
That's beautiful. So this last question, I'll let you choose.
Okay.
One, if money was no object, how far would the Weeping Cedars universe go? Or two, what is something that the listeners and your readers and fans would not expect to know about you that you're willing to share?
Right. I feel like I put so many of my interests and things into the show, like video games and computer programming and old technology. And, I feel like there might not be a lot to mine there, other, yeah, other than just like, I think I'm generally not a very good person. So like, it's just throw that out there and be like, yeah, I have as many bad moments and terrible choices in my history as anybody else. So please, no one think that a good person writes this show. On top, I mean, so if money was no object,
Yeah.
oh, I would love 3 seasons of TV.
Yeah, 3
Like
seasons?
3 seasons of TV. I would love to be able to say, like, give me 3 seasons to tell a story in Weeping Cedars.
Mm,
And I almost certainly, I mean, I know what it would be. It would be the mid 80s. It would be the first historical society group,
okay.
the video game developers and what happened to them in the mid 80s.
Okay.
I want to, I want to do my Stranger Things,
Yeah.
but give me 3 seasons to tell that story. That's the dream, right? Like, I mean, and much smaller dreams. This is funny because you mentioned, you had some stuff published. You're better than I am, because outside of academic stuff, I've never had anything published. No one's ever invited me to participate in a writing thing. No one's ever been like, hey, you write this, come be part of this thing.
Yeah.
It just never happened. Sort of smaller dreams, it's that sort of thing. But money is no object. It would be, I mean, really, money is no object. There would be video games too.
Okay.
And in fact, I started working on a video game because, again, I've been a programmer for 20 something years as well. But it was one of those projects where I was like, I can't do both. I can't do all the things at once. But if I ever did make a lot of money as like a writer, I think, I mean, other than like making sure we had a house that I wasn't constantly trying to make sure it wasn't going to fall down, it would be I'm sitting here. I told you beforehand that I had to like water seal my basement. Like, we just had a big storm. So right after this podcast, I'm going down there to see if there's water in the basement. But beyond that, I would want to employ people. I want to employ people. I want to, make video games by saying, okay, good. I've got 2 programmers. I got an artist. I've got, little projects that can take this idea further. But I'm not going to do them all myself. So like that's kind of the dream is employ other people to make this thing a reality. Yeah, that's probably. But where I think I will go is, I hope that I'm making an okay salary doing this in 5-6 years, after I've released, 7 or 8 books. And those are more of the modest, like, reality goals of, just keep writing the stories, keep writing, see where it goes, see where's there have been, when we first started the show, the main power that was talked about was the librarian, and then that expanded to the queen and Samite. And now another one of the powers is rearing his head in story after story. And I'm like, okay, well, we're going to have to deal with this guy soon. So, just keep kind of following wherever the muse leads you.
Yeah. And if you were to, make 3 seasons, what streaming service do you think you would want to like pick up and fund the show? Like, would it be Netflix, Apple, Amazon, Shudder? Like,
Okay, so for a moment there, I was like, man, there are no good options, because I don't love what people are putting out. And, like, I'd want a contract with Netflix that said I actually got all 3 seasons. And David Zaslav is my least favorite person in all of business. Like, I hate that guy. I like, please let somebody else run HBO. But when you mentioned Apple, I was like, oh, yeah, okay. Because the TV that Apple's putting out, I have just so much respect for. Severance. We just watched The Studio. Apple TV is putting out some really great shows. And if they were like, cool, we made Severance, we want to make a Weeping Cedar show, I'd be like, great. As long as I get my 3 seasons, I'll be happy. But yeah, I think Apple TV would be the place. Because I look at what, like, I think the only thing that I really like that Amazon is doing is Invincible.
Okay.
But I feel like the last thing that HBO did, and I'm not watching everything that they're doing, but well, that's not true, because The Penguin was pretty awesome. But the first season of True Detective to me is still like peak television, maybe ever. I just rewatched it because I'm like, I'm writing a detective story, gonna take inspiration.
Yeah.
I need to rewatch it. But yeah, it's I also wouldn't be real picky if if someone offered me a contract. If I was like, okay, I get my 3 seasons, I get to write my scripts, good. But I will tell you who I will never let touch. It's Jonathan Nolan. If Jonathan Nolan comes to me with $1 million check, and He's Christopher Nolan's brother. He
Mm.
wrote, he's responsible for the mess that is The Dark Knight Rises. Um, I would say no, thank you, sir. I'll move on without you.
I'll shoot this in my basement myself.
Exactly. Yeah, I'd rather do that than have that guy write my
All right,
scripts.
that sounds pretty fair. So, I can't. I could honestly, I could do this all day and keep asking you questions and you know delve more and more into like your thought processes and the overall universe and I could spend 5 more hours just talking about Rod of Amber, Lightning Falls, the book series from now until the end. I could do this all day, and hopefully at some point, if I didn't bore you too much, you're always welcome to come back. But
Yeah, I'd love to come back.
yeah, so with that being said, how do the people find you? What's something coming up that you want the people to know about? This is your time to plug whatever you'd like.
Yeah, so I'm assuming this is going to come out once the Kickstarter's done because there's only like 5 days left of the Kickstarter. You can kind of, uh, a lot of stuff is about to drop. So I did announce that book that's going to come out next year, which is going to be called Welcome to Weeping Cedars, which is the sort of modified transcript of that show. But Shards of Amber is coming out in September. Hopefully, that's the short story collection that fleshes out the show Rod of Amber. And then Lightning Falls, which is, again, a very hefty novel, is coming out in October. But you can kind of find all of that just at weepingcedars.com. There's a link there to the Patreon where for free, you just have to become a free member. You get access to all the short stories that are currently publicly available. And then there's a link to the Reddit where people are having discussions about stuff. And I'm active there with the community. And then there's the Etsy as well if people like stickers. There's a bunch of Weeping Cedars stickers out there. But yeah, so that's weepingcedars.com is really where you can kind of find everything.
Sweet, that's amazing. Also, social media, Weeping Cedars on Instagram and Threads, correct? Anywhere else?
Yeah, I'm also sort of always lurking around Blue Sky and Tumblr as well, but Threads is really where I post stuff.
Man, still using Tumblr. That's a crazy statement. That's like
So it's new in that like I found people just posting about Weeping Cedars on Tumblr, and I was like, oh, I should be here then.
no way.
I was like, oh, there are fans here. That's interesting. Yeah.
It's like going on Tumblr kind of reminds me of like going back into the Halo 2 servers, but now
Uh-huh.
where there's like
Uh-huh.
8 other people and they're only playing
Uh-huh.
with each other. And because like I remember in college when Tumblr was huge, like it
Right.
was the preferred method of social media. And then when it got bought by some other company and they were like,
Mm-hmm.
nudity, gotta go.
Right, yeah.
Uh,
The moment Tumblr was like, no more tits.
yeah,
I'm like, wait, what?
yeah, it's
What are you doing?
yeah, it's kind of the same thing with OnlyFans. Like OnlyFans
Mm,
was known for a certain
right?
kind of entertainment,
Yep.
and when they were like, "Hey, we're transitioning away from this," and they started doing like baking shows, people are
Right. Yeah,
like,
musicians and stuff. Yeah.
"Yeah," and they were like, "No, we're good." The owner, luckily, before things went too far, he was like, "Oh, yeah, I was kidding about the other stuff.
Yeah.
You don't
Right.
you don't have to watch the baking shows. Just prove,
We know why you're here.
yeah,
Let's just, yeah.
yeah. We
Uh,
just prove that you
yeah.
like to, and you're good."
Right. I do feel like I actually kind of forgot about that, but there was that sort of seismic. That was the same with Imager too,
Mm.
right? Because Imager at one point went like, okay, cool, no more nudity. And everybody on Reddit was like, wait, what? Um, whole swaths of the internet's now just gone.
Yeah, it's like who's doing this and why?
Yeah, it is a weird. You see a lot of that now. I think I've seen it on TikTok a fair amount of just like the modesty movement where people are just like, what's with all these thong bikinis? I don't want to see people's butts in the supermarket. And I'm of the opinion that if somebody has a butt in the supermarket that I don't want to see, I can look somewhere else.
Yeah, you got to make an active effort to look at someone's butt, unless
Yep.
unless you're grabbing something off of a lower shelf and they
Right.
are running at you backwards, or you're tripping or something along those lines for the
Right.
or unless on the rare occasion you're like a dwarf or a little person that
Right, where it's just in your line of sight,
yeah
or potentially they're very tall.
so I'm 6 foot 6'1",
Okay, yeah.
so I'm like that's something I've never had to worry about.
Right,
Like
yeah.
unless I'm walking next to Shaq and like
Right,
the starting lineup for the NBA Dream Team, I don't think I've ever had to
right,
worry
yeah.
about turning and being at eye level with an ass. But
Right, yeah.
it's that weird idea of I'm unhappy with myself, therefore I'm unhappy with other people being okay with themselves.
It's also this weird idea that everything attractive is sexual. So the idea that, like, if a dude I'm a straight dude, but if like I wouldn't wear them because I'm not happy with my body. But if dudes started wearing these midriff style shirts again, like
So
I'd be like, all right, bro, I don't feel comfortable with my body right now, but okay, good on the abs, like
I
if you
I swear it's so funny that you bring this up because I was literally talking to someone about this yesterday.
Uh-huh.
And like I was in Alabama for a wedding in October, and one of my buddies, he only wore like floral shorts and crop tops the
Okay.
place that we went, unless we were actually at the wedding, in which case he wore like a
Sure.
very beautiful suit. But I was like, I don't have the body for midriff, uh,
Right,
any
right, yeah.
kind. But I'm like, I got decent legs. I like showing off my leg
Mm-hmm.
tattoos. I'll wear, like just above the knee shorts.
Sure. Oh yeah.
And one of my buddies was like, "Hey man, don't take this the wrong way. I was kind of scared for you and our other friend." I was like, "Why?" And he's like, "Well, because like he's gay and wearing, fucking cut off t-shirts
Uh-huh.
and you're black and you're wearing, floral short shorts." And I was like, honestly, one, I don't give a shit anymore. But
Right.
two, I'm just like, dude, it's comfortable. Like I
Mm-hmm.
hate wearing pants. I think pants are the devil. But it's like at a certain point, like either you're going to be okay with yourself or you're going to start actively making changes and
Mm-hmm.
you're going to be okay with the progress that you're making. And that's
Right.
kind of where I'm at, where I'm not happy with where I'm at, but I'm constantly working on it. And
Mm.
when I was younger, I didn't want to make the effort, so I was unhappy with people who were comfortable with their bodies or
Right.
were where I wanted to be. So now I'm just like, dude, if I ever reach the point where I'm so delusional, I'm just like, you know what, not losing any more weight, going straight to crop tops. Hey man, it's gonna be it's
Uh-huh.
gonna be everyone else's problem in the grocery store.
Right, yeah.
But if I get in shape, it's game over. I'm
Well, yeah, and I was in pretty good shape right before the pandemic. Then when the pandemic hit, like, like years of being inside
yeah.
has taken its toll. But like, yeah, I'm also just like so on one level, inherently the human body is sexual. On another level, inherently the human body is not.
Hmm.
Right? Like it's a butt is not inherently sexual. So just because you see some cheek doesn't mean that you gotta like all of a sudden be like, oh, my Lanta. Like
Yeah,
it's not.
it's a very interesting discussion
Hmm.
because there are so many people who have never had that conversation
Right.
and they don't understand like, hey man, maybe if you looked at a butt once in a while, you wouldn't go crazy when you actually do
Right.
see one. And
Right.
I think,
Yeah. Normalizing things.
yeah, like, you normalize seeing a butt or seeing some tits or seeing a stomach, and you don't go
Right.
crazy when you see one, and you're not like a caveman trying to bash people over the head and drag them off into the woods. Like, there's no need for that. Like, don't make it
I,
weird.
I do think that there is something to be said for, I mean, just as a, as a former adolescent boy who longed to see boobs in real life, like, I think I would have had a lot less of a weird relationship with all that stuff
Mm,
if it was way more normal, like it would have occupied a very different place in my mind
yeah.
if I wasn't, just in a society that thought growing up in the 80s that thought breastfeeding in public was some sort of monstrous, thing that had to be hidden.
Yeah.
So yeah, but that is really just a whole nother long ass conversation. But
Yeah, the irony that at the same time of demonizing breastfeeding, but also
mm-hmm.
saying it's your constitutional right to drink and drive in the 80s,
Right,
in the
right.
same breath is
Oh yeah.
perplexing. Like,
Oh, it was a wild time.
yeah, I love, to this day, I love seeing those videos of one guy was like, "This is communism," as
Yup.
he's like being interviewed. He's like, "Hey, you have to
Yeah.
wear a seatbelt," and the guy's like holding a beer with a cigarette in his
Yup.
mouth, and he was like, "Goddamn communists! I didn't fight the Japanese for this," and it's like those things don't even connect.
No, there's no mental connection for it. It's one of those interesting things when you start thinking about what place words and concepts occupy in people's minds
Yeah.
and what they encompass. And you find out, just like communism, I am not a fan of communism as an actual philosophy. I don't love communism, but like I have a pretty good idea of what like Marxism in practice looks like, and it's not seatbelts, right? Like it's
Hey man, it's like, hey, man,
like it's not being allowed to drink and drive.
yeah, it's like, hey, maybe don't put everyone around you in danger. And he's like, nope,
Right.
I'm an American patriot. I'm gonna drink and drive. My kids aren't wearing seatbelts. My car is 8,000 pounds of steel. I'm
Yes.
gonna shotgun this 6-pack of beer, and I'm going to get wings. It's like,
And I'm driving down Freedom Road.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, it is wild. It is wild how some of that stuff plays out in people's minds.
then so this has been amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I feel like
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
literally anytime, like not even having to think about the concept of talking about the Weeping Cedars universe. We can talk about whatever, because I mean, given your, you know, literary background, your literary prowess, your, education, all these things, you're actually really fucking funny, which is something you don't always expect, because again, like a lot of people in the literary world that I know, they're very, very strange people, but like not
Mm.
like in a negative sense, but they're just like, hey, literature is my life. This is all I care about. I don't have time for anything else.
I think maybe that's the answer to that one question you're going to ask, is like what would surprise people.
Yeah.
Is I think if they went on Monday nights to my friend Ashton and Chris's Twitch streams, and I'm on there cursing up a storm while we're playing Plate Up or Repo or something like that,
Okay.
and just all the Jersey is coming out where F-bombs are like breathing. And like that's me, right? Like I am more than happy to sit and discuss epistemological limitations to quantum physics, but I'm also there just fucking shooting dudes in Halo and Call of Duty. Like it's I was raised by a teacher and a high school dropout, and he was from the Ozarks of Missouri and hill people. So like those things are baked into my DNA, that I'm when I don't have to be smart, I'm happy to just bro down. Like,
yeah, it's amazing having, like, being able to have that dichotomy where it's like, hey, I'm really smart, I know all these things, I have all this real world application, but also sometimes I'm just a dude.
yeah.
And it's kind of the same thing that happens with me because of, what I do for the local government, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the nonprofits that I work with, and having a podcast where I talk about mental health and things like that. And then people come see me do comedy and they're like, I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't expecting this at all. And I'm like, yeah,
Right.
crazy, right? Like,
right.
yeah,
Exactly.
it's like, turns out when
Exactly.
you eat a bunch of mushrooms and you give someone a microphone, things just sort of come out.
Yeah, I love dichotomies like that, and I like meeting whole people, because that's, in a lot of ways, you can be a whole person. I'm not going to say you can't if you're just laser focused on one thing,
Mm.
but you gotta, again, authenticity is a big thing for me, and so pretending to be something you're not, when you still love to sit around with the dudes and just laugh your ass off
Mm.
for 2 hours, at things that nobody else is going to think is funny. That's if you know, that's part of being who you are. And if that's it, then don't drop that just because you like Percy Bysshe Shelley.
Yeah.
You know, like my friends will laugh at me when I'm like, yeah, so I was sitting and reading Tennyson the other day, and they're like, yeah, of course you were.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, you fucking nerd. And it's like, yeah,
right, exactly.
yeah. So we're going to end the episode here. Thank you again so much. If you all get the chance, please check out weepingcedars.com. Support J.W.G. Wise and everything that he's doing. You know, give Weeping Cedars a listen on Spotify. So you can find Weeping Cedars everywhere online as far as any listening platforms. Check it out. Rod of Amber seasons 1 and season 2 is out right now as well.
Season 3 just wrapped this week.
Boom.
So that series is now complete.
Boom.
Yeah.
Season 3 just wrapped this week. By the time this comes out, season 3 will have already been out for probably a week or so. Then he's got books coming out. Lightning Falls is coming out. Then he's got short stories with Shards of Amber. There's something for everyone. And for anyone who appreciates part of it, you can appreciate all of it. So, speaking on appreciation, the idea of taking something that we love and something that started off as just that, just an idea, and taking the time to let it grow and to let it cultivate into something so much more has the ability to impact people's lives around us that we never could have considered. And, you know, I think Mr. Wise can speak to that to a certain degree. And I can speak to that to a certain degree. I never thought I would be doing more than talking to myself on camera. And now I've been very fortunate to have guests like him and other people who have come on the podcast and people who stop me to say, hey, I really love this episode that you did. Or, hey, this topic that you spoke about is something that I really needed to hear. So
that's awesome.
Take your passion, cultivate it, put it out there in the universe, because you never know just how much it's going to impact the people around you. So we're going to end the episode now before we start on another rant. So from me, your host, Joe Buck, and from today's guest, Mr. J.W.G. Wise, there's 3 things we can leave you with. Be good to yourself, be good to the world around you, and remember, above all else, we love you, homie. We'll see you all next time.